Hey there, true crime fans. I don't know if most of you guys listen in the morning, getting ready for work, or at night before bed, but it doesn't matter because it is always time for true crime. See what I did there? I'm your host, Julia, and if you like cases that keep you up at night and cause you to go down the rabbit hole, then this episode is for you. In the past 100 years, a shocking number of people have gone missing in the American wilderness, particularly in national parks and preserves, and a large number of them are children. So today, I'm going to be telling you about 5 different cases, each one about a child who mysteriously vanished in an American national park. As of 2017, David Paulides, an expert in national park disappearances, claims approximately 1,600 people have strangely gone missing in the American wilderness. Paulides is now in his mid-70s, but has spent years researching some of the most bizarre missing children cases. It all started back when David was a police officer. He was on vacation, staying in the lodges at one of America's national parks, when he was approached by a park ranger who said he needed to talk to him. The ranger asked David to look into the number of people who had disappeared in national parks, specifically in the American West. He said the events of the missing were very unusual, and a lot of the time, the people were never found. But the weirdest part, he said, was that the National Park Service was doing everything they could to keep a lid on it. David's interest was piqued, and he decided to look into it. But once he began looking, he realized how big this thing was. A major problem was that because national parks and preserves are considered federal land, it becomes unclear as to who is responsible for the missing people. When someone goes missing, the local police usually take care of it. So who takes care of these cases on federal land? Some would say the National Park Service. But the National Park Service does not keep track of their missing people. No database to store names or evidence. David believes the NPS knows how many people are missing, but they don't want to release that information. The cases were also incredibly strange, preternatural as David describes them. After thousands of hours of research, David started the Can-Am Missing Project, which catalogs cases of people who disappear or are found on wildlands across North America under what he calls mysterious circumstances. He has published 7 books and a documentary, all part of his series called Missing 411. The documentary is actually what inspired me to look into this further, and it can be found on Amazon Prime. However, in his work, he never expresses his theories. He keeps it to facts. Some have talked to David about it and apparently get the feeling that he thinks something paranormal could be happening. But again, he's never actually published anything saying that. I think people assume that's what he thinks because he is a believer in the paranormal and in urban legends such as Bigfoot. That's why he doesn't want his beliefs on other things to influence his research of actual cases or to discredit him in any way. So, now with a bit of background, let's get into some of the cases that David has studied. Samuel Belkey, known as Sammy, was 8 years old when he went missing from Crater Lake National Park in Oregon on October 14th, 2006. Sammy and his dad Kenneth were staying at the Diamond Lake Resort, and on Saturday afternoon decided to hike up to the Cleetwood Cove Overlook. The overlook gives a stunning view of the lake and the striking blue water that Crater Lake is famous for. They parked their car and started off on the Cleetwood Cove Trail. A bit about Sammy. Sammy was a sweet boy with lots of energy. He also had Asperger's syndrome on the autism spectrum. Around 4 p.m., the two were almost back at the car to go back to their cabin when Sammy saw something yellow at the top of a nearby hill, and thinking it was gold, ran up a steep slope away from the road that the car was parked on. His dad immediately started to run after him, calling his name and telling him to come back. Thinking it was a game, Sammy ran up further to the top of the slope. His dad followed him up, just a minute or two behind him, but when he reached the top, Sammy was gone. Kenneth searched for his son for 2 hours before a search and rescue team was called. At 6 p.m., 25 search and rescuers, as well as cadaver dogs, searched for Sammy. Because Sammy was on the autism spectrum, he didn't react well to loud noises, so the searchers couldn't use whistles or loudspeakers to try to call his name or get his attention. The next day, rangers called for outside help, and a helicopter did an aerial search with heat-censoring cameras. Even expert rock climbers were called in to rappel down the rocky cliffs to see if Sammy was in any of the hidden rock ledges. No traces of Sammy were found. Later on, a search team found a deflated yellow balloon further into the forest. Could this have been the yellow thing that Sammy ran to? Perhaps he had been carrying it while walking on his own through the forest, though I don't believe they could actually link the balloon to Sammy. On October 21st, the search was officially called off, as they were sure that if Sammy had still been out there, he would have succumbed to the elements by now. Most at the scene, however, assumed an animal had attacked him. But keep in mind, Sammy disappeared basically on the side of the road. It was a steep slope right beside the road. So, would an animal really risk going that close to a major road with people nearby? There was also no sound of Sammy screaming, and his dad was only 50 feet behind him. How could an animal possibly snatch him that fast and run off without Kenneth seeing or hearing anything? Now you're probably thinking, was the dad ever investigated? And the answer is yes. He was investigated and deemed not a suspect. I am really curious as to how nobody heard or saw anything, though. Sammy wasn't exactly on a trail, but presuming they had just exited the trail heading back to their car, a trail must have been nearby. The trail they walked was also the only way down to the shoreline of the lake, so it must have been fairly busy. I feel like he easily would have been heard if he had called for help or screamed. Even if his dad didn't hear him, maybe someone on the trail would have? The only thing I can think of is that I know when kids on the spectrum run away or wander, they sometimes don't come when their names are called because they're scared of loud noises, like Sammy, or they get nervous hearing their name being called. Maybe Sammy hid when they were looking for him because he was scared, and then unfortunately died from the elements. But even if that did happen, there has been absolutely nothing found. Not his shoes, his coat, his remains. It's like he vanished into thin air. Sammy is still listed as a missing person, and in 2017, a composite sketch of what he may currently look like was released. And I'll post this on all my social media channels for you guys to see. Sammy Belkey has been listed as a missing person for almost 14 years. The next case is the one that drove me down the rabbit hole. On October 2nd, 1999, 3-year-old Jared Adadero goes missing while hiking with a large group in the Roosevelt National Forest in Colorado. Jared's father, Alan Adadero, owned a resort with his brother up in the mountains of Colorado, and that Saturday, Alan was up there with his 2 kids, 6-year-old Jocelyn and 3-year-old Jared. Alan was part of a Christian singles networking group, and one of the events was a weekend up at Alan's resort. Just to be clear, this group wasn't a dating service or anything. It was just a group that would do social events together, and a nice way to meet other single Christians and stuff. The group had planned to drive up to the trout hatchery, but for whatever reason, Alan decided to stay back. I assume he had probably been to the hatchery a few times if he owned property in the area, or maybe he just wanted to hang back and chill at his cabin. The group invited 6-year-old Jocelyn to come along, and Alan said yes. Of course, if you know kids, That meant that now 3-year-old Jared wanted to go too. Alan hesitated at first, but after Jared had been begging to go for a while, Alan caved. After all, he would be with a group of adults and his big sister. So, on Saturday morning at 10 a.m., the group drove up to the fish hatchery. After that, they decided to all go for a walk on the Big South Trail nearby. The Big South Trail is a beautiful path through the trees and along the Prudhoe River. While the group was walking, they started to spread out, some of the faster walkers going on ahead, and the slower walkers who kept a leisurely pace behind. About 1.5 miles into the hike, Jared began running ahead. Sometimes he would run ahead, wait for the adults, and then jump out and scare them on the path. But after 15 or 20 minutes, one of the adults realized they hadn't seen Jared in a while, so they started walking a bit faster to try to catch up to him. At this time, Jared had spotted 2 fishermen beside the creek and stopped to talk. He asked them if they had seen any bears in the woods. The 2 men noticed that the child was alone, but for some reason didn't think to stop him or ask him who he was with, so Jared ran off again. This occurrence was actually never told to Alan. Alan had heard it on the news after it was leaked by the media, and then was able to corroborate the story. But why wouldn't the authorities tell him this? After adults couldn't seem to find the toddler, they frantically began to call out his name. Jocelyn and a few other adults had remembered hearing Jared scream earlier, but according to Jocelyn, she said it sounded like a playful scream. You know how kids are loud when they're running around and playing. A couple hours later, Alan was awoken by some of the members of the group after he had fallen asleep on the couch. "There's a problem with Jared," one of them said. At first, Alan thought perhaps Jared had fallen and scraped his knee, or maybe broken an arm. But then he was told that they couldn't find him. Alan immediately hopped in his truck and drove up the road to the start of the trail. He then continued to hike up the trail, screaming Jared's name. Jared had to be around somewhere. After all, the trail was an out and back trail. But when Alan couldn't find his son himself, 65 search and rescue professionals and cadaver dogs were called in. They searched in wolf dens, through the brush, and in the river. Some members even hiked further up the mountain, where the pass was covered with snow. There were no footprints, which obviously meant Jared hadn't made it that far. Jocelyn remembers coming back after the first search and seeing her father kneeling on the ground crying. That's when she realized how serious this all was. The next morning was Sunday, and a helicopter was dispatched to fly overhead to look for Jared. But on its way back from refueling, about 100 feet off the ground, the helicopter started to struggle with the fuel load and mountain conditions. Then, the helicopter fell, falling 100 feet near the trail below. Thankfully, all 5 people on board survived the crash, but 2 were left with very serious injuries. This just made the scene way more hectic. While searchers looked for Jared, victims of the crash were pulled out on stretchers while authorities taped off the crash site. But the search continued on through, with more people checking the riverbanks and a dive team checking the small pools of water along the trails. Then, a day after Jared went missing, so on the Sunday, a park ranger from Mesa Verde National Park reported seeing Jared, swearing up and down this was him. This seems unlikely to me though, because Jared couldn't have gone there by himself, so why would you take a kid from one national park and bring him to another park 8 hours away? But I definitely would have wanted police to look into this lead if it were my kid, and according to Alan, sheriffs told him that they had interviewed the ranger, and it didn't look like a probable lead. Later though, Alan found out from the ranger himself that nobody had ever come to follow up. The search went on for 8 days, 24 hours a day, before it was finally called off. Absolutely nothing was found. Alan found out later that hundreds of volunteers, even missing persons professionals, as well as teams with experienced cadaver dogs, were turned away by investigators when they offered to help. I guess investigators thought, We already had a couple dogs up there, and they didn't smell anything, and they had a big search and rescue team, but why wouldn't you take the extra help? It just seems weird that they would turn down any volunteers. So, like I said, nothing was found. Until almost 4 years later. On June 4th, 2003, two experienced hikers were up in the mountains at the top of a steep slope, 500 vertical feet above the Big South Trail, when they found a small white sneaker. Not long after, they found the other shoe, a brown fleece jacket, and some blue sweatpants. Being familiar with Jared's case, they called authorities right away and discovered the shoes, sweater, and pants all matched exactly what Jared was wearing the day of his disappearance. These items had belonged to Jared. The sweatpants pretty much only had one leg left, as the fleecy material of the pants had been picked apart by birds and rodents for their nests. But the strange thing was, the pants were inside out. As for the sneakers, they almost looked brand new. There are pictures of the shoe that I'll post on Instagram, and they look super clean. Worn, but clean. They had a green and blue stripe across them, and the colors were still bold and vibrant. And these shoes have apparently been out in the wilderness with snow and rain and animals for 4 years. The forensic lab later determined there was also no blood on any of the clothing. With the discovery of the clothes, searchers went up to the same spot to look for the remains of Jared Atadero. 11 days later, they found one singular baby tooth, just sitting on top of a log, and a skull cap, both which were later determined to be Jared's. At the time in 2003, forensics was only able to confirm an 86% chance these remains were Jared, but a decade later, new technology was able to give almost an 100% match. So there you go. The disappearance of Jared Atadero had been solved. Or had it? Jared was dead, but how? Let's get into the theories. The most common theory, mainly by investigators and police, is that he was taken by a mountain lion. But there are a few problems with this theory. First of all, there was no blood on the clothes. If you're going to be taken in a mountain lion's jaw, you would have blood on you. Experts on mountain lion behavior say they usually eat the stomach and neck of their prey first. Mountain lions are not going to carefully take off Jared's clothes first and then eat him because, as I said, besides the birds getting at the pants, the clothes were intact. Investigators responded to this by saying that Jared must have taken off his clothes before the lion got him. The problem with that is the place where Jared's remains were found was 500 vertical feet up. David Politis has actually hiked up to the remain spot and said it wasn't an easy hike, as some parts he had to climb on all fours and he had to take several breaks. After all, it was expert hikers that found him. So how could Jared, a 3-year-old kid, make it up there? And that's when people say, oh, the mountain lion dragged him up there. So you're telling me Jared took off his clothes on the trail. The mountain lion dragged his body up to the top of the 500-foot slope and then was like, BRB, I'm gonna go get his sweatpants, jacket, and sneakers. That's just not probable. Even if the mountain lion had dragged him up here and then somehow undressed him, which obviously is impossible, but let's just pretend, how are his shoes that clean? If you're being dragged through mud and sticks and dirt, your shoes won't be white and in perfect condition. Have I convinced you yet that this was not a mountain lion? If not, I've got more. Did the mountain lion just place the tooth by itself right on top of a log? Also in perfect condition, by the way. I'll post all of these pictures on social media. After 4 years, you'd expect the tooth to be buried under debris and brush. And the final nail in the coffin for this theory is evidence that was given to us from the lab. 1, there were no mountain lion hairs found on the clothing. But two, when Jared's skull cap was sent to the lab, it was noticed that the skull had deep scratch marks across the cranium. For investigators, this meant that it must have been a mountain lion. But experts have confirmed that those scratches didn't come from any known animal, and the cause of the indents on the cranium remain unknown. I don't know about you, but with all that evidence against the theory, I just don't see how it could have been a mountain lion. But if it wasn't a mountain lion, what else killed him? I don't think he died of exposure or succumbed to the elements, because that wouldn't explain how he got to the top of that 500-foot cliff. And also, all of his clothes were found, but only a skull cap and tooth were found? If he had died in his clothes, wouldn't evidence of decomposition still be there? Maybe some more bone fragments or something? Okay, enough rambling. Let's look into the second theory. The theory that Jared was taken and killed by a person. If someone had grabbed Jared and walked away with him, wouldn't someone have heard him scream or see something? After all, this was a hike out, hike back trail, meaning there's only one way in and one way out of the canyon that they were hiking towards, and it's not accessible by car. So how could somebody have grabbed a child but then stayed hidden and gotten Jared out the 2 miles to the road? Especially with everyone actively looking for him. And keep in mind, I said before that members of the group did hear Jared scream, but that it was a playful scream. Another thing I forgot to mention was that when David Paulides hiked up to see the spot that Jared's remains were recovered from, he found a Rubik's Cube that looked as though it had been there for years. The colorful stickers were no longer there, and it was pretty tattered. So this could be pretty far-fetched, but since this was an area that children didn't hike up to, some people really read into this and theorized that maybe whoever took Jared gave him this toy to play with, maybe to keep him quiet or maybe to distract him. Though other than finding it where the remains were found, there's no real link from Jared to the toy, so that could be grasping at straws. I just thought it was a bit chilling. Jared's cause of death is still a mystery that may never be solved. On his death certificate, Jared's cause of death is ruled undetermined. Our next case today is the case of 8-year-old Douglas Legg, who vanished from Adirondack Forest Preserve's Santanoni Preserve on July 10, 1971. His mother's side of the family, the Melvins, actually owned the Santanoni estate and were staying at the main lodge. The camps were known to attract pretty wealthy businessmen and their families for summer vacation, so this was a nice area that probably wouldn't host the average Joe. Douglas has spent many summers up there with his family, so this was just another typical day of a typical summer. On the afternoon of Saturday, July 10th, 1971, Douglas, known to his family and friends as Dougie, went out for a walk with his family. Dougie was a pretty experienced hiker and was familiar with the area since he spent so much time there. His family even referred to him as a mini woodsman. Shortly after beginning the walk, his uncle spotted poison ivy and told Dougie to run back to the lodge and put on some long pants. It was a straight trail back, and they weren't very far out from the cabin, so it wasn't crazy for an 8-year-old to go by himself. Dougie was reluctant to go, but finally ran back to change. When he was about 150 feet away from the lodge, he ran past his older brother and cousin, but that would be the last time anyone ever saw him. When he didn't return by sunset, the family called for help, and a team of 30 volunteers searched for Dougie that night. And this case was handled a bit better than the other ones, because in 1971, the Santanoni Preserve was actually a private estate. Unlike most preserves, the Adirondack Forest Preserve is partly privately owned. I mentioned in the beginning that it's difficult for police to investigate on federal land, but at this time the Santanoni Preserve was owned by the Melvins. Anyway, so the next morning, with still no sign of him, police brought in cadaver dogs, helicopters, and forest rangers to assist in the search. They also used heat-detecting infrared technology, and drained swamps and ponds, but found nothing. It's reported that a dog tracked Dougie's scent for 30 miles, which is 48 kilometers, but the scent was then lost. This just doesn't make any sense, because how did a kid walk that far in 1 or 2 days? There was, of course, the theory that an animal could have dragged him out that far, most likely a black bear. But 1, that's a far distance for even a bear to drag its prey, and 2, Dougie was 150 feet from the lodge when he was last seen. Black bears are very timid and wouldn't attack a human in an area with other humans walking around. In fact, they usually don't attack unless provoked or feel their young are threatened. And if it was a busy area with lots of families doing outdoor activities, the bear wouldn't have brought its babies near that. With no further leads, the search was called off after 6 weeks, and for the next 20 years, the case didn't change. But in 1993, the case was opened again. A woman called police claiming that Dougie had been kidnapped by a relative of hers and that his body had been dumped into a lake in Lewis County. Authorities took this very seriously, searching the bottom of the lake, but came up with nothing. It was later discovered that this woman was a psychiatric patient who suffered from false memory syndrome. Either way, I still think it was a good idea that they looked into it. So, that was kind of a bummer, but it didn't end there. After this woman's claims had renewed interest in the case and brought it back into the media, a man came forward to say he had found a small, partial skeleton, including a skull, while hunting at Newcomb Lake back in 1973. And for the record, this was very close to Santanoni Estate. He never reported it because at the time of the discovery in 1973, he was on leave from the Navy and not where he was supposed to be. So he didn't want to get in trouble for breaking the rules, so he left it, as he didn't even know of Dougie's case at the time. But once hearing Dougie's story on the news, he called in. Investigators, of course, went to go take a look, but 20 years later, whatever the man had found was gone. And that's the latest update on Douglas Legg. Although presumed dead by most, he is still considered a missing person. Next year will be 50 years since he vanished. Okay guys, time for case number 4. Dennis Martin went missing on June 14, 1969 at Spence Field in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park in Tennessee, just 6 days before his 7th birthday. Dennis, his older brother Douglas, his father William, and his paternal grandfather Clyde had all gone camping for the weekend. It was a Father's Day tradition. This was Dennis's first year going on the boys' trip, and he was really excited. And I also just want to mention that Dennis was in a special education group at school because his mental age was slightly behind his chronological age. They had just hiked to Spence Field, located right beside the Appalachian Trail, that morning, and intended to camp there for the night. Spence Field was a grassy mountain highland meadow, so it was the perfect place not only to pinch your tent, but also to have your kids run around and release some energy. While running around playing, Dennis and Douglas met 2 other boys camping in the area, and while their father talked to the other kids' parents, the 4 boys played hide and seek. Coincidentally enough, the other family was also the Martin family. I guess it's a popular last name, but still a little eerie. So it was just after 4 p.m. when the boys began concocting a prank on their parents. They would go behind the bushes where the parents were sitting chatting, and then jump out from different directions to startle them. The kind of prank that all kids find hilarious, and that most of the time the parents see coming and pretend to act surprised. Douglas and the other 2 boys went one way to run behind the adults, and since Dennis was wearing a bright red shirt, he was told to run the other way, as they thought Dennis might blow their cover because he was so easily seen. So Dennis agreed and ran the opposite way to sneak up behind his father from another angle. And just like I said, Dennis's father William saw the boys run away and he saw Dennis hide behind a tree. But when the other 3 boys jumped out, Dennis had missed the cue. William immediately started calling his son's name, telling him to come out, but Dennis didn't come. His tone started to get more serious as he ran around the area looking for his son. William recalls that within 3 minutes of losing sight of Dennis, he was already running 2 miles down the Appalachian Trail looking for him. 3 minutes. So William goes off in one direction, and Grandpa Clyde goes the other way looking for little Dennis. A couple hours later, a couple came walking up the hill from Cades Cove, one of the most popular valleys in the park and where the Martin family had hiked from that morning, but reported that they hadn't seen or heard anything from a child. After this, Grandpa Clyde went to tell park rangers that his grandson was missing. Even though rain poured while thunder rumbled, a search was executed and lasted until nightfall. Then, hours after Dennis was reported missing, the Keyes family, who were hiking nearby, reported that they were hiking approximately 6 miles from Spence Field around 6:30 when they heard a boy scream. I want to mention that several different articles had different accounts of how far away the Keyes family were from Spence Field. All reports agreed that they were hiking in Sea Branch, though one said that Sea Branch was only 2 miles away, some said 6 miles, and one even said 10. However, I looked on Google and it said the trail from Sea Branch to Spence Field is about 7 miles long. Anyway, Mr. Keyes' young son then said he thought he saw a bear walking upright with something slung over its shoulder. The father corrected him, saying it was a man with something over his shoulder. Apparently, some men in the woods dress in animal pelts while they hunt, so this could easily have been just a man in his hunting gear. Even though hunting is illegal in national parks, but maybe he was breaking the rules, I don't know. Either way, authorities said it was impossible for a boy to walk 6 miles in that time frame and didn't even look into it. The family even offered to come back to the park and show them the exact location where they had heard the scream and saw this bear man, but authorities refused to help. Mr. Martin claims that he wasn't told about this report until later because authorities said they didn't think it was important. But if my kid were missing, I'd want to know everything that's going on. So later, the search expanded to rangers, volunteers, bloodhounds, and helicopters. Even the FBI stepped in. Which is weird because FBI don't usually assist in missing person cases unless there is a clear sign of foul play. Just to point that out. The bloodhounds were also unable to pick up his scent. But it just wasn't plausible that a boy had gone missing when his dad had eyes on him literally 3 minutes before he vanished. Especially because he was wearing a bright red shirt. I mean, that's why he was sent alone in the first place. So how could he not be seen? Even if he had stumbled off and gotten lost, he couldn't have gone so far in 3 minutes that he wouldn't hear his family calling his name. According to his family, Dennis was also an experienced hiker. Eventually, the search was called off after 6 weeks, and Dennis's father actually spent the entire 6 weeks in the national park looking for his son. Months after his disappearance, hope was ignited by the discovery of small footprints and a pair of boys' underwear in the woods near Spence Field. However, Dennis's mom was sure the underwear did not belong to Dennis, and therefore the footprints weren't assumed to be linked. That's still weird, though, to find a child's underwear very near to where a child went missing. But maybe since it was a popular camping area, someone had just lost them while camping. Theories for this one are the same as the others. Perhaps he was kidnapped, perhaps he got lost, or maybe an animal got to him. But I don't see any of these being a probable theory because why wouldn't he scream if he were kidnapped? And he was only meters from his parents. That's pretty ballsy of a kidnapper. I just don't understand how he vanished in 3 minutes and nobody saw or heard anything. His dad even saw him hiding behind a tree. It's not like he was wandering off. And finally, the animal doesn't make sense because, like I said in the other cases, a child would scream or cry if attacked by an animal, even like a quick shriek or something. There were also no animal prints around, and it was the middle of the day with lots of people nearby. Dennis Martin has been a missing person for 51 years. However, his father believes that some kind of foul play was involved. And that's all I have on that, which brings us to the last case I'm going to talk about today. This one goes back all the way to 1958. Bobby Bishop was only 10 years old when he went missing on August 15th, 1958. Bobby was attending summer camp at St. Malo Retreat right at the border of the Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado. At the time, St. Malo Retreat was used as a boys' camp run by the Catholic Church. Part of the camp was St. Catherine's Chapel on the Rock. Built back in 1936, the church stands on top of a rock overlooking the creek and is kind of a hidden gem of the park. So, Bobby was 10 years old at the time, and because of a hearing impairment, he had to wear hearing aids. He also didn't speak super clearly because of his hearing, so he was a pretty shy kid who just liked to keep to himself. One day at camp, Bobby had gone fishing up nearby Cabin Creek, as the creek runs pretty much right beside the camp. Though the creek does get a little bit wider if you walk up the hill, so that's where Bobby went. Around 6 p.m., a counselor walked up the hill to the river to inform Bobby that it was time for dinner. Bobby acknowledged the counselor, packed up his stuff, and the two started walking down the hill back toward the camp. And although the counselor was walking in front of Bobby, he did note that Bobby was following shortly behind him. But then, when he reached the camp and turned around, Bobby was gone. A search was immediately started with volunteers, park rangers, and the local sheriff's office all assisting. But everyone was confused on how Bobby could have gotten lost because the way back to the camp was straight downhill on a very defined path. Flyers were handed out everywhere, with Bobby's parents expressing how much they needed their son home. Bobby's father was a sergeant in Denver's Air Force, so a team of airmen came out to search with their aircrafts, as well as cadaver dogs and divers to search the waters. But then, a sighting of Bobby was reported in Estes Park, 15 miles or 24 kilometers north of the camp. Normally, I'm the kind of person to blow off sightings from strangers because it's very possible another kid could have looked like Bobby. But the thing about this sighting that seems so credible is that when a clerk in a hardware store in Estes Park began talking to the boy pointed to his ears and mouth and then left immediately. And remember, Bobby was part deaf and as a result had a speech impediment. However, this wasn't deemed a credible lead because it was 15 miles away. I'm not sure how many days after his disappearance that the sighting was reported. I think it was like 1 or 2 days, but officials thought that no kid could have walked that far in only a couple days. Also, even if it was multiple days later, he would have had to been staying overnight in the woods, scrummaging for food, and then he stumbles into this town and doesn't ask for help. There were also no reports that he looked stressed or like he had been living in the wilderness for days. After 9 days, the search for Bobby was then called off. And for 10 months, no leads were generated. But then, on June 6, 1959, 3 counselors who had searched for Bobby the summer before went back to the mountains. While 2,500 feet up Mount Meeker, the men found scraps of clothing, what looked to be small pieces of bone, and a hearing aid. They had found the remains of Bobby Bishop. But there were so many details in this discovery that just didn't add up. The first was that Mount Meeker had already been thoroughly searched 3 times during the original investigation for Bobby. If Bobby had died there, how was his body not found with dogs, planes, and searchers, yet tiny fragments of bone and a hearing aid was found a year later? That makes one think that he must have not been there at the time of the original search. So was Bobby still alive after 9 days of searching and later went to Mount Meeker? Or was he brought up there? Another thing that had everyone scratching their heads was the location. Mount Meeker was 3.5 miles west and 2,500 feet up from the camp. If Bobby perhaps had gotten lost, Why would he walk uphill when all he needed to do was walk straight down the hill? Also, how did he climb up a 2,500-foot mountain? For a 10-year-old, I guess it's possible, but doesn't seem very logical. This was quite an intense hike, even treacherous in some parts. The boy hadn't had dinner yet, so he was probably hungry. So why would his instincts tell him to walk uphill away from the camp? If the sighting in Estes Park was really him, that means he would have walked 15 miles north and then another 15 miles back southwest. I feel that also if he was in that area, I think he would have heard the search. I know he was partially deaf, but he did have his hearing aid, and there were planes and loudspeakers calling for him. That's just my guess, though. And I've said many times in this episode, but most people assume when someone dies in the wilderness that an animal had something to do with it. But experts have said that even if he was eaten by an animal, more pieces of bone would be left. I mean, when remains were found, it was only small scraps of bone remaining. So, how did Bobby Bizup die? Just like Jared Atadero, his cause of death was never determined. David Paulides, who I mentioned before was an expert in national park disappearances, was suspicious because many of the children going missing had, in his words, a genetic deficiency or a physical or mental impairment. And of the 5 cases I covered today, 3 could fall under those categories. Sammy had Asperger's on the autism spectrum, Dennis had a younger mental age, and Bobby had a hearing impairment. So is that just a coincidence? There are so many other cases just like this one. I chose these 5 cases because they were interesting to me, and in some of them it really feels like the child just vanished out of thin air. But I strongly encourage you guys to look into this more if you're interested, and learn about some of the other cases because there are so many. Also, go over to my social media channels and you can see all the pictures that I've been talking about during this case. And please tell me which of the 5 cases were your favorite because I would love to know. Thanks for listening to another one of my episodes. And if you guys did enjoy this, please leave me a review on Apple Podcasts. Thanks so much, guys, and have a good week.